On the morning of February 6, 2019, Michael Cochran believed he was finally about to see the truth. The 38-year-old father of two was preparing for a private flight from West Virginia to Lynchburg, Virginia, where he expected to meet people connected to a business he had trusted for years. His wife, Natalie, had told him about government contracts, major payments, and money that was supposedly waiting for them. Michael believed the trip would finally prove that everything was real, but that flight never happened. Natalie canceled it that morning, and by that afternoon, Michael was unconscious on the kitchen floor of his own home. 5 days later, he would be dead. At first, there was no murder investigation. There was only a grieving family trying to understand how a seemingly healthy husband, father, and youth sports coach could suddenly collapse. But beneath that tragedy was another story already beginning to unravel: a financial scheme involving millions of dollars, promises of government contracts, and investors who were demanding answers. Years later, investigators would connect that collapsing business to the mysterious circumstances surrounding Michael's death. What began as a financial investigation would eventually become a murder case, forcing one devastating question into the center of everything: what really happened to Michael Cochran? Michael had spent most of his life building something ordinary and meaningful. Born in Beckley, West Virginia, in 1980, he grew up in Raleigh County and developed a passion for sports from a young age. He played baseball, basketball, and football, began lifting weights as a child, and eventually won a powerlifting competition in high school. But sports were only part of who he became. As an adult, Michael worked in information technology and built a family with Natalie, the woman he had met as a teenager. They married in 2000, settled in Daniels, West Virginia, and eventually had 2 children, Nicole and Ashton. To the people around him, Michael was especially known for being a father and a coach. He coached youth football and baseball and was the kind of adult who showed up not only for his own children, but for other kids who needed someone dependable. One family friend remembered Michael taking a young boy who had lost his father fishing and bringing him to practices, giving that child a sense of stability. For nearly 2 decades, Michael's life appeared steady: a husband, a father, a coach, and a man deeply invested in his community. Nothing about that life suggested that the person closest to him might eventually become the center of a criminal investigation. In 2017, everything seemed to change when Michael and Natalie became connected to Tactical Solutions Group, ORTSG. The company presented itself as a government contracting business and claimed to supply the United States Department of Defense. Natalie left her career as a pharmacist to run the company full-time, while Michael held a minority stake. 2 friends and family. It looked like an ambitious new chapter. The trusted pharmacist from their community was now an entrepreneur involved in government contracts, and the couple appeared to be building something much bigger than the life they had known before. But according to investigators, the reality was dramatically different. TSG had never actually received a federal or state government contract. Another company associated with Natalie had obtained 2 state contracts, but both were eventually canceled because of repeated delays. Still, Natalie presented the business as a major opportunity. At least 11 people eventually invested approximately $2.5 million, believing they were putting money into lucrative government contracts. Prosecutors later said false emails and stolen identifying information were used to make the business appear legitimate. The deception was not just a promise, it was supported by an entire manufactured paper trail. The lifestyle made the story easier to believe. The Cochrans owned multiple homes, motorcycles, a 1965 Shelby Cobra, and took expensive trips to places such as Paris and Hawaii. To outsiders, the money seemed to confirm the success Natalie had described, but there had already been warning signs. Natalie had once served as treasurer for a youth baseball league, and after a fundraiser, people began questioning whether money was missing. A private investigator later identified purchases at stores and restaurants made with funds that were supposed to support the children's program. Natalie was never criminally charged over that matter, but the suspicion was there. Michael, however, appeared to be on the inside of the business without understanding its true nature. Former investigators testified that he did not know the company was fraudulent. He helped look for contracts to bid on, but investigators said that was largely the extent of his involvement. As investors began demanding their money, Michael also started asking questions. Messages examined by investigators showed him trying to understand why the amount of money investors claimed to have provided did not match what Natalie had told him. He was not investigating his wife as an outsider. He was a husband and business partner trying to understand why the company he believed in did not seem to have the money it was supposed to have. Then came the trip to Lynchburg. Natalie had arranged what was supposed to be a meeting with bank executives where Michael would finally see the money connected to the government contracts. A pilot was booked for the morning of February 6, 2019. According to Michael's close friend Christopher Davis, Michael was genuinely excited. After years of believing in the business and waiting for answers, he thought this could finally be the moment when everything made sense. But on the very morning of the flight, Natalie canceled it. Whatever Michael expected to discover in Lynchburg would never be discovered. That same day, inside the Cochran home, Michael became critically ill. A neighbor testified that Natalie said she was sick and needed insulin, and insulin was brought to the house. Later, Natalie contracted a contractor named Jason Bowen and asked him to come because Michael was sick. Bowen arrived and found Michael unconscious on the kitchen floor. He tried to get a response from him, but Michael did not react. Other people came to the home, including a physician assistant and Michael's friend Christopher Davis, and both recognized that he needed medical attention. Yet Michael was not taken to the hospital immediately. By the time he finally arrived, his blood glucose level was only 21, and doctors found severe brain swelling. He never regained consciousness. On February 11, 2019, Michael Cochran died at just 38 years old. To the people around him, it looked like a sudden medical tragedy. He had been a husband, a father, a coach, and a man known for his energy and physical activity. His obituary remembered his love of life and youth sports, and his family asked for donations to support baseball at Shady Spring Middle School. There was grief, confusion, and loss, but there was not yet a public accusation of murder. Michael's death appeared to be the terrible ending of an unexplained medical emergency, but while his family was mourning, another investigation was gaining momentum. Investors who had put their savings into Natalie's business still wanted their money back. Federal authorities eventually became involved, and in June 2019, police searched the Cochran home as part of the financial investigation. During that search, they found insulin. At the time, that discovery did not immediately transform Michael's death into a homicide investigation. It was simply documented and preserved. But it would become one of the details investigators returned to again and again. By September, Natalie was indicted on federal charges involving wire fraud, bankruptcy fraud, and money laundering. The financial picture was becoming impossible to ignore. The federal case revealed the scale of the deception. Prosecutors said Natalie had persuaded at least 11 people to invest roughly $2.5 million into a business built around government contracts that were either greatly exaggerated or did not exist. Even after Michael's death, investigators said, Natalie continued seeking investors. The scheme had not ended when her husband died. In 2020, she pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering and agreed to pay millions in restitution. In March 2021, she received a sentence of 135 months in federal prison. To the public, it looked as though the story was finished. A fraudulent business had collapsed. Its architect had been convicted, and the financial victims would seek restitution. But investigators had not forgotten Michael. The insulin found in the home remained important, and questions surrounding his death refused to disappear. In November 2021, while Natalie was already serving her federal sentence, she was indicted for first-degree murder in connection with Michael's death. His body was exhumed for another examination, but 7 months after burial, decomposition had made it impossible for the medical examiner to identify clear injection sites or directly confirm insulin use in the tissue. The autopsy could not establish a definitive cause of death. That uncertainty would eventually become one of the central arguments of the defense. When the murder case finally reached trial in January 2025, prosecutors presented a theory built around motive, timing, and medical evidence. Their argument was that Michael had been getting too close to the truth about the financial scheme. The Lynchburg flight, they said, represented a dangerous moment for Natalie. If Michael reached the bank and discovered there was no money behind the promises, the entire fraud could unravel, and with it, Natalie's freedom. Prosecutors argued that the canceled flight was not an ordinary change of plans, but part of the chain of events that led directly to Michael's collapse. Medical testimony became the heart of the trial. Endocrinologist Dr. Diane Krieger testified that insulin was, in her professional opinion, the only explanation that made medical sense for Michael's profound hypoglycemia. Forensic pathologist Dr. Paul Uraby went further, concluding that Michael had been administered insulin and that his death was a homicide. There was no direct physical evidence of insulin remaining in Michael's body because of the years that had passed before the exhumation, but prosecutors pointed to the extremely low blood glucose level, the insulin recovered from the home, and other evidence they believed supported their theory. The prosecution also highlighted conflicting accounts Natalie had given about what happened inside the house that day. The defense did not deny that Natalie had committed financial crimes. Instead, attorneys argued that being dishonest in business did not automatically make her a murderer. They focused heavily on Michael's long history with fitness, supplements, and alleged steroid use. His daughter testified about the enormous quantities of supplements she said he took. While both children described alleged steroid use, the defense suggested that Michael's death could have resulted from another health problem or from substances he had been taking. Rather than anything Natalie had done, the jury rejected that explanation. On January 29, 2025, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, Natalie Cochran was found guilty of first-degree murder. The speed of the verdict was striking, especially after years of uncertainty surrounding Michael's death. But the case still had one final chapter. Under West Virginia law, the jury could recommend mercy, which could eventually make parole possible, or deny mercy and leave Natalie facing life without the possibility of release. Her children asked the jury for mercy. Her mother pleaded for the chance to see her daughter again and argued that Natalie's children still needed their mother. But the jury reached its decision that afternoon. No mercy. Natalie Cochran was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her attorneys later sought an acquittal or a new trial, challenging issues including the venue and the admission of certain evidence, but those motions were denied. And after everything, the financial scheme, the canceled flight, the mysterious collapse, the years of investigation, and the courtroom battle, the story came back to the same man at its center. Michael Cochran was not remembered simply as the victim of a crime. He was remembered as a father who showed up for his children, a coach who invested in young people, and a husband who spent years believing that the person beside him was telling him the truth. Perhaps that is what makes this case so unsettling. Michael did not spend his final days believing he was living inside a criminal investigation. He believed he was finally going to understand the business he had trusted. He believed the money existed. He believed the explanations he had been given. And according to the prosecution's theory, the closer he came to discovering that those promises were false, the more dangerous his questions became. 6 years after his death, a jury ultimately decided that Natalie was responsible for his murder. But behind every document, every financial figure, and every courtroom argument remains something much more human. Michael spent 19 years trusting the person closest to him. And that trust became the very thing that cost him his life.